like the dates are selected. So you might think, wow, you're starting off with, really two rock star students, which is indeed the case. But those were kind of random selections. We're all rock stars this year, right, Josh? I mean, we really are. Shalia, how are you? We will start the Q&A from the front row, but after a few minutes, we will open that up to questions from the audience. Ms. King should be here. She, as the senior teacher. Okay, Miss Birch is running late. She's like in the she's like here, but she's stuck in traffic on one. We'll give her a couple minutes. I think she's worth it. Just a little bit of info. This is Miriam's final project. It is 149 pages.
No, there was not any shelf in it. I mean, I guess.
Longest project ever, only being surpassed by her classmate in row 3, Veronica, who finished at 175.
I don't know. That might be best.
Okay.
So,
I don't think it's that bad.
Yeah.
you all right? Let me call Miss King.
It's working.
Angie King, where are you? We'll put Miss King on the end there, and if Miss Birch, I'll just move the spot for her. Hey, there she is. Hey. You okay?
Yeah.
You what? Passed out? I thought you said I passed out. I'm like, hey! Rosie from Dallas. Look at that. Great outfit, brother. Oh, look at this. This is a green team. You know how to pick them right. This is a pretty awesome team. Great timing. We're just on time. Anyone wants to fill in those seats there, and then if people come in late, they can fill in some of the back seats. So.
Are we gonna close?
Yeah, we will. It is a great day, academic day for PA. How's the temp, Miriam?
It's fine.
Fine, okay. If we need to adjust the temp, we can turn it down a degree or two if needed. I think we're right on time. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to day 1 of 11 days of Senior Honors Thesis Defenses, year 21 for this. Obviously, we're christening a new room for the defenses here up in the World Language Building. Again, today we're starting off with 2, I don't think that it's a stretch to say legendary students, but we'll go down as Hall of Famers, without a doubt, if they don't crash in front of the next hour. No pressure. No pressure. Oh, come on, Fran. Come on, you gotta lighten up a bit. Let's see what like. Again, those of you in the audience and soon to be thesis students, this is basically a 9-month process, and you'll be selecting topics probably as soon as May when we start having brainstorming sessions. This is obviously Miriam is going to be attending University of Virginia as a Jefferson Scholar, and so proud of the work she's done over the years from 9th grade on. I know Mr. Simmons isn't with us right now, but I think you had the longest 9th grade paper he's ever read, and so you continued with that trend in 10th and 11th grade with papers that were in excess of 35 pages, and in junior year paper over 40 pages. As some of the audience members heard, this is a 149-page senior thesis. Outstanding piece of research and writing. I know the committee members were thrilled to work with her on this project, and of course, since it was announced last week, she is our valedictorian and number 1 in the class of 2023. Let's give it up for Miriam.
Good afternoon. My name is Miriam Prey, and today I'll be presenting my honors senior thesis, The Weaponization of Life, an Analysis of Martyrdom, Hunger Strikes, and Self-Immolation. I'll first begin by discussing some of my most important sources. First, Starve and Immolate by Banu Bargu not only convinced me that there was enough information out there on this topic, but also contained the key terminology, namely the phrase, the weaponization of life. It also introduced me to the Turkish case study and different lenses I could use to analyze this topic. The next book, Dying to Win by Robert Pape, served as a foundation for my second chapter, along with Mia Bloom's book, Dying to Kill. Both opened my eyes to the inherently logical nature of suicide terrorism and the history of martyrdom that preceded it. Finally, Refusal to Eat by Neon Shah covered many of the case studies in my third chapter and helped me understand the nature of protest and how it is used to combat injustice. The weaponization of life is defined as the tactic of resorting to corporeal and existential practices of struggle based on the technique of self-destruction in order to make a political statement or advance political goals. Offensive weaponization of life means killing oneself and others, while defensive weaponization of life means killing just oneself. 3 types of weaponization of life are studied in this thesis: martyrdom, hunger strikes, and self-immolation, although more do exist. There are 10 case studies throughout this thesis, 3 per each example of weaponization of life, and 1 overarching example. These case studies were selected based on their influence on the evolution of the tactic, their success, and sometimes their defiance of expected patterns. The first step to understanding the weaponization of life is that it is not the same as suicide. When we think of suicide, we most often think of what sociologist Emile Durkheim defined as egoistic suicide, when one is far removed from society and seeking to escape. The weaponization of life is nothing like egoistic suicide, for it is not associated with mental health issues or personal problems. It is about advancing a greater cause. Thus, the weaponization of life most closely aligns with what Durkheim defined as altruistic suicide, but even this does not entirely recognize how the cause may be more important than social integration itself. To begin my chapter on martyrdom and suicide terrorism, I first studied religious martyrdom. Religious texts like the Bible and the Quran recount countless stories of men entering battle and dying for their religion, being praised as martyrs afterward. In these cases, martyrdom manifested as a normal occurrence due to battle and a method of death that was praised rather than shunned. Martyrdom also existed in a more unconventional form with a few early terrorist organizations, such as the Ismaili Assassins. This group rebelled against the Sunni state and assassinated key leaders with a dagger, killing themselves upon completing their mission. The more conventional form of religious martyrdom eventually transitioned to a more nationalistic cause. The most famous example of this is the kamikaze pilots during World War II who killed themselves as they crashed their planes into U.S. naval vessels. This transition marked the use of martyrdom not just as a possibility in battle, but rather something to be used intentionally, which leads us to modern-day suicide terrorism. Today, suicide terrorism is defined as situations in which the attacker does not expect to survive the mission and often employs a method of attack that requires his or her death in order to succeed. As seen in this graph, suicide attacks have not only increased in number over time, but have also comprised a greater proportion of attacks used by terrorist organizations. While the data here ends in 2013, it is clear that there's an upward trend. There are 2 types of organizational motivations for suicide terrorism: strategic and social logic. Strategic logic argues that such attacks are immensely effective in achieving the collective cause. Suicide terrorist organizations are most often trying to convince a government to change its policy, make a foreign state withdraw from their perceived homeland, or gain autonomy themselves. Suicide attacks compensate for weaker military power, kill key targets without needing an escape plan, and often do damage at a lower cost. On the other hand, social logic highlights how terrorist organizations are not only trying to create instability, but also incite fear while maintaining legitimacy. Suicide attacks send a message to the opposing society attempting to break their will to resist. Within the terrorist organization itself, the use of suicide terrorism allows readers to create rhetoric around martyrdom that helps increase loyalty to the cause. While there are many individual motivations as pictured here, I'll only be focusing on a few. First, it is important to note that while psychology influences suicide terrorism, suicide terrorists are not mentally unstable. They may hold previous trauma or create dissociative defenses that help them carry out the attack, but they still do so with reason. Second, some of the personal reasons behind suicide terrorism are seeking revenge or compensating for an otherwise insignificant life. One does not have to have a direct grievance in order to have motivation in order to have revenge as a motivation. Instead, they can be angered on behalf of something that has occurred in their community. Finally, it is important to note that religion is not necessarily a motivation, but rather a facilitator. This means that organizations use religious texts to justify their actions and thereby convince people to join, but is not their primary reason for doing so. One of my 3 case studies for suicide terrorism was the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Located in Sri Lanka, the minority Tamil ethnic group felt oppressed by the majority Sinhalese. Although initially nonviolent methods were used to combat this discrimination, a more militant generation led to the rise of the Tamil Tigers in the 1970s. It is important to note that the Tamil Tigers were based upon a legitimate cause, but used violence as their solution. They were not religious, instead nationalistic, and alienated some moderate Tamils through their use of indiscriminate violence. However, those who were close to the cause received many beneficial social services. Until their defeat in May 2009, 70,000 people died in the conflict against the Tamil Tigers. The group is especially known for its use of high-level assassinations, such as the death of former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. In the broader context of suicide terrorism, the Tamil Tigers are known for pioneering the suicide bomb jacket, in addition to the use of women in suicide attacks, inspiring other terrorist organizations. The second form of weaponization of life studied in my thesis is hunger strikes. While hunger strikes are said to have existed for centuries in some countries, the first strike of international significance occurred in Russia in the late 19th century. Here, imprisoned exiles and political convicts began a strike against carceral oppression. From there, news of the strike spread to other countries where it was adopted as a tactic. Hunger strikes are unique in that they allow the actor to control the communication process. They have time to adjust their strategy based on the enemy's reaction, the ability to conduct negotiations, and a chance to revoke death. In fact, most hunger strikes do not end up in death. Instead, the actor just uses its possibility as pressure against the authorities. My case study for this chapter focuses on the British and American suffragettes who used hunger striking after being imprisoned. Beginning with Marion Wallace Dunlop in the United Kingdom, the hunger strike was adopted more widely by the suffragette movement as the government began to quickly release those who were on strike. After a few months, however, the British government grew frustrated with the practice and eventually resorted to force feeding. Stories of harsh treatment created the impression that the authorities were responsible for all of the strikers' suffering, allowing the suffragettes to convince the public. The tactic of hunger striking eventually made its way to the United States with American suffragette Alice Paul. Paul and her fellow suffragettes faced equally brutal experiences of force feeding, and eventually they succeeded in placing enough pressure on the government to get themselves released. While it is unclear whether hunger strikes were the main reason for suffragettes eventually gaining the right to vote for women, as many people claim it was women's contributions to World War I, the suffragettes' use of the hunger strike put the tactic on the world stage for many others to emulate. The final form of the weaponization of life studied in this thesis is self-immolation. While self-immolation technically means any sacrifice for a collective cause, it has come to be associated most commonly with autocremation, or lighting oneself on fire, which is the main focus of the case studies used in this thesis. Self-immolation holds an advantage, particularly in comparison to hunger strikes, due to its clear visibility in the public eye. This benefit is diluted by the fact that the immediate death of the protester prevents them from controlling the integrity and dissemination of their message. Compared to hunger strikes, which have arguably become an acceptable form of protest, autocremation seemed to generate less sympathy and awareness, perhaps due to the instinctive response to look away in a self-defense-like mechanism. On June 11, 1963, Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc burned himself to death in a Saigon intersection to protest the persecution of Buddhists by the minority Catholic South Vietnamese regime. Sitting in the lotus position, he remained in a state of meditation as nuns and monks blocked fire engines from dousing his body. Unlike previous historical instances of self-immolation, Quang Duc's sacrifice was not isolated, instead prompting waves of self-immolation across Asia and even the United States. In doing so, his self-immolation fundamentally reshaped protest tactics worldwide. Those who followed in Quang Duc's footsteps did so to express concern over the war. One such person was Norman Morrison, a Quaker alarmed by the indiscriminate violence occurring in Vietnam. Morrison drove to Washington, D.C., and burned himself to death near the window of Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time. He took his baby daughter Emily with him, but she was separated before he was engulfed in flames and surprisingly escaped unharmed. Both Quang Duc's and Morrison's deaths may not have directly contributed to the end of the Vietnam War, but the deaths of such self-immolators must be counted alongside the other bodies that returned home from the war as factors that made the U.S. unwilling to fight anymore. While I will not go into full detail on one of my other self-immolation case studies, Tibet, I will address it in the context of the role of authorities and institutions. Beginning in 2009, a wave of self-immolations occurred in Tibet, protesting oppression by the Chinese government. In 2012, Stephen Prothero, an American religious scholar, posted an article criticizing the Dalai Lama for his relatively neutral stance. This begs the question of what authority figures and institutions should do when members of their community engage in self-sacrifice: condemn, condone, or remain silent. However, the issue with Prothero's and other such stances criticizing the authority is the Western gaze and neocolonialist mindset from which they approach the Tibetan nationalist struggle. The Western media fail to uplift the Tibetan voice, romanticize the region, and ignore the self-actualization that comes along with self-immolation. In doing so, they further dehumanize the Tibetan people, depriving them of the same agency taken away by the Chinese state. Instead of condemning the actions by authorities and institutions from which these people are a part of, the focus by the international community should be on condemning the source of oppression. This same issue is seen in another case study of this thesis, the Turkish hunger strikes of the early 2000s. An article by Scott Anderson in the New York Times Magazine focuses on the angelic nature of a female hunger striker he met, how he tried to get her to stop fasting, and general disregard for how the people around him wanted to be perceived. Perhaps the biggest issue with the Western gaze is that the narrow view of success as legislative or political change, when in reality, some of these actors seek intangible successes regarding their identity. The purpose of this thesis is to understand the weaponization of life, but this is not possible if one holds such a narrow view of the phenomenon with the Western gaze. As we look to address the future of the weaponization of life, it's important to address vulnerabilities and patterns. For both suicide terrorism and suicide protests, it has been argued that democracies are the most susceptible. However, there has been a lack of information and cases of conflicting studies in both cases. Regardless, democracies hold a unique role when addressing these acts, given that they theoretically prioritize upholding human rights in their response. As for its effectiveness, suicide attacks allow terrorist organizations to achieve more than they would otherwise. As seen here, suicide attacks are more lethal in terms of average fatalities and average wounded compared to any other option with terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, suicide protests have the ability to reignite movements that would otherwise die out. While only a few suicide protests have had political consequences out of thousands that have occurred, once again, we cannot limit success to solely tangible consequences, although they are important indicators. Going forward, the weaponization of life will undoubtedly remain part of the global repertoire of resistance tactics. Studies show that past suicide terrorism attacks globally make the strategy more likely, meaning the tactic will continue to be used in the future. As for suicide protests, sociologist David Phillips published a study documenting how well-publicized suicides lead to a spike in the overall number of suicides, naming this phenomenon the Werther effect. This essentially speaks to the imitation that occurs after suicide protests, and thus with social media, it is clear that suicide protests will continue, perhaps in an amplified manner. One moral dilemma with the defensive weaponization of life is that actors are typically seeking a better life, but are also willing to die for it, creating a stark contradiction. However, the right to life cannot merely be simplified to the right to breathe and exist. Instead, it is only meaningful when preserved in conjunction with other fundamental rights. Since the main purpose of the weaponization of life is not death, it cannot be considered a violation of the right to life. While seemingly about the right to die, the weaponization of life is instead about seeking agency, meaning, and a sense of humanity for the individual. As written here, suicide protesters are not in search of death, but rather looking for real life. The morality of these acts often comes into question as well. The moral value of the weaponization of life depends on three things: the intention, the act itself, and the aftermath. For the act itself, all acts are inherently violent, but whether or not the harm is restricted to the individual affects its moral standing. While the actor cannot control the aftermath once they are dead, they do hold a responsibility to ensure that their message, whatever it may be, is preserved as it was intended to minimize moral culpability for imitation. Jean-Paul Sartre argues that everyone must consider their actions as recommendations to others, and thus even these actors should recognize what they are suggesting to the entire world. Likewise, the media also holds a moral responsibility to ensure that these acts are interpreted and responded to in the way they were intended. Understanding of the Werther effect has raised concerns about how the media presents and inadvertently encourages suicide or self-sacrifice. Nonetheless, the media must still report on these acts, ensuring that the actor's life and message do not go to waste, but with careful representation that neither delegitimizes the actor's sacrifice nor encourages drastic action. Finally, our role as bystanders demands that we respond to public self-sacrifice with attentiveness and remembrance. We hold an obligation to the dead, not only to remember what they did, but who they are. Whether or not we choose to recognize this duty, ignoring this obligation disavows not only the dead, but their deeds, allowing them to fall by the wayside into a void of actions that never occurred. Remembering those who resort to the weaponization of life is not only about telling or carrying on an individual story, but also a story about humanity, our capabilities, rights, and defiance of limits. Simply pausing to remember these stories may not spark the demanded change, but it rehumanizes an action we are quick to turn away from out of confusion and fear. As anthropologist Karen Andriolo states, if we turn the other way, protest suicides are killed twice, once by their own hands and once by the silence of our imagination. Thank you.
Very easy question to start out with. Why did you choose this topic, and what did you find most challenging as you went through this entire process over the last 8 to 9 months?
So this project was built off of things I had kind of previously learned about in classes or written about previously. My sophomore year, I wrote a paper on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and a key part of that topic was the Irish Republican hunger strikes in the 1980s. So that's mainly where the idea came from. The most difficult part of the project was probably synthesizing like different information and tying it to like the philosophy and ethics of the weaponization of life.
Primary narratives, was it difficult to find, again, people that are involved in these political movements, whether it be the Tamil Tigers or Hezbollah, a group you mentioned in your thesis but didn't have time to discuss today? Were you able to integrate enough primary narratives? Is that something you felt that you would have liked to attempted to do more of, and what were you able to at different times?
I think my primary narratives are probably the strongest for hunger strikes. Generally speaking, the most information is out there on suicide terrorism, but the information for suicide terrorism is at a different angle compared to the other forms of weaponization of life that I studied.
To my colleagues here?
Well, that speaks to the Western gaze. I know in your conclusion, you started the conclusion with Western gaze, and I was so intrigued with that being kind of the lens through which you began the conclusion. And I was thinking about it then as you were talking about the morality, the Werther effect, and I was thinking about like how we can reconcile the issue with the Western gaze with the essential, I'm assuming, and I think you even argued essential media attention for efficacy, especially for defensive weaponization of life. So hunger strikes and self-immolation. And is the problem specifically international news outlets, American news outlets, and how can news outlets do justice to these important stories while minimizing the Western gaze and then possibly the Werther effect? I just asked several questions. This is where my mind was going. I don't know if you remember in my notes, I kept on being like, well, what about the Western gaze? Because you started me with that idea and I was kind of fixated with it and very, it was very compelling.
So with the problem with Tibet, which is what I used to introduce the Western gaze, was at that point in time, it was possible to contact Tibetans about what they wanted to say on the issue, but instead they focused on the American perspective of it when they could have been interviewing Tibetans and asking them how they felt about the oppression. So I think that's the first step, is that when there are people protesting, like the government or authority view is not what's needed. It's these people who are seeking agency, and by not letting them speak, we're denying them more agency. In terms of the Werther effect, I think once Phillips' study was published in the 1980s, there is more of a fear of talking about them than there is allowing these people to speak. And I think that presents a concern. But with the use of social media, people are able to get their voices out there, maybe not in those conventional like news outlet forms.
Was there a question about publishing the actual images of self-immolation and autocronation? If I'm just curious if that was something that came up.
So his study mainly focused on like different ways of quantifying it. So it was like number of newspaper pages or airtime. I don't necessarily know about the images.
So I want to piggyback off of Ms. Birch also, because I thought that was fascinating aspect of your thesis, especially from me having a journalism background as well. So did you find at all that when it comes to the media's role, was there anything, especially thinking about how our modern media works and this constant, instant, 24/7 access that we have, how did that, or did you find anything that shows how that affects the public's view of the weaponization of life, that we constantly have this access to media? Does that bring it more to light, or does it actually bury it at, like you said, how sometimes the media can neglect the actual person's meaning and role in what they do?
I think generally speaking, it has brought more attention, but sometimes it's not bringing attention to what that person intended, not like their specific message.
Okay. And so then with that, the other part that I found fascinating was your case studies and what you had to say about the hunger strikes and this idea of, especially with the suffragettes, how they relied on the empathy of other people in order to get their message across. I compare that then to also our modern lens. Has the effectiveness of hunger strikes decreased in that ability to cause change, simply because we see more nationalistic viewpoints rather than global viewpoints, and we see so many of these hunger strikes happening abroad and not really within our own borders, or that it's not really reported on as much?
I think as a whole, the weaponization of life is based on the fact that only humans can sacrifice their life in such a way. It's inherently built upon emotion. For suicide terrorism, this means working off of the idea of fear, but also belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the defensive weaponization of life, it is about that empathy, like the fact that people can relate to suffering, hunger, things like that. I think the problem today is that when we see these acts maybe occurring somewhere else, we're not thinking about the fact that these people are also human, and that's what they're attempting to regain through their act.
All right, I'm going to change it up a little bit. So over and over again, we see this struggle between a bigger power who has access to more resources versus a smaller power who is often being oppressed by the bigger power. In almost all cases, the oppressed employ weaponization of life against the oppressor. So I have a few questions that stem from this. So my first one, which you actually touched on quite a bit in your presentation, but can you briefly explain why the weaponization of life proves so effective against a group, organization, or country that has twice, if not more, the resources and force?
Yeah, so for suicide terrorism, this is really based on like the organizational logic behind it. I referenced this earlier, but like democracies cannot respond in the same way that terrorist organizations act. They have an obligation to act in a certain way. So by employing people's lives they automatically gain an advantage over a higher power. And they are within the group, they are able to say this is the greatest form of sacrifice, and they increase loyalty. For hunger strikes and self-immolation, it's once again built off of that idea of empathy. Hunger strikes always place the blame on the authority. And even if it's resorted to force feeding, that's actually more helpful in some ways. It worked out for the suffragettes. But when you look at cases like Guantanamo Bay, it's a way of silencing them, which is why force feeding is considered unethical in almost all cases.
This leads me to my second question. So although upon first look, it seems like the instances of self-immolation amongst the students in India present a challenge to this power struggle, because this time it's the oppressors that employ weaponization of life. So how do these students fit into the power struggle model? And what does this say about the reality of oppression versus the perception of oppression?
So like a brief explanation for those in the room, because I didn't include the India case study in my presentation, but in 1990, there was a series of self-immolations in India, about 200, by middle class, upper caste students who were upset about affirmative action policies for lower castes. And this case study stands out because it's not those who are the most oppressed that are resorting to the weaponization of life. And this speaks to the idea that one does not actually have to be oppressed. They just have to feel as if they're being oppressed. The weaponization of life is about attempting to regain agency. These students felt as if they didn't have a greater quota in the education system, they wouldn't have a good life or control over where their life was going. So they try to use the defensive weaponization of life to regain that agency. And it's also important to note that like a lot of these acts pertain to the government. So in that way, they were still not at the top. They still had the government over them, and that's who they were trying to convince.
Phenomenal job on your presentation and your research. Of course, I haven't had the opportunity to read your thesis yet, but I love the comparative case studies and your approach to this topic. Did you find that, we just came out of our big culture unit, still kind of at the end of it in human geography. Did you find that there were any kind of cultural traits amongst these various groups that you looked at that would make a particular region or country or group of people more likely to, go through this process of self-immolation or suicide in order to make a statement such as this?
Yeah, so I would say with hunger strikes and self-immolation, there is a lot of like history behind that. When I talked about the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, there is a history of that there being used. Sociologist Michael Biggs also found that there was a correlation between self-immolation and Buddhism and Hinduism, just because that has been used in some cases in the religion to express religiosity. Like devotion. But it's not necessarily that the religion encourages, more that it's been accepted as a sacred thing and people are now using it in a different form.
And kind of to go off of that, did you find any kind of stark differences between the offensive and defensive kind of approaches to suicide in this way? Culturally or independently, I guess?
I would say culturally, not necessarily, but there is a tendency to try to find those patterns within suicide terrorism and relegate it to a certain group, but that is not necessarily true because suicide terrorism, once again, religion is not a motivation more than it is a facilitator, and that could really be applied through any religion.
Excellent.
I've got one more question, then maybe a few from the audience. Role of technology. Because martyrdom operations now are relying so much more on technology and advances in this area, has this made martyrdom operations more highly successful, more popularized, especially in the last 20 years since the War on Terror began?
So I would say technology as a whole has accelerated the weaponization of life, both offensive and defensive. In terms of offensive, suicide terrorist organizations can really play into those individual motivations I discussed earlier through the use of propaganda. And now they have an equal advantage compared to governments, as so many people use social media. And you see that with Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And then with the defensive weaponization of life, the most obvious example tied to social media is Mohamed Bouaziz's self-immolation in Tunisia. And it spread across the Arab world due to social media and resulted in one imitation, but also political consequences.
Let's open it up to the audience, maybe for 2 or 3 questions, and then turn over to Josh. I'll let you choose who you want to call on.
Sarah?
So did you see like a difference in efficacy between like suicide terrorism and just terrorism that doesn't end up killing the agent?
Yeah, so I had a graph on there earlier, but generally speaking, suicide attacks are the most effective attack that a terrorist organization could use. Obviously, there is a point where you can't always be using suicide attacks because that is diminishing your group itself. But generally speaking, those are the best in terms of inciting fear, but also the amount of damage. Nico?
So like regarding the role of the media and how like there's so many like self-immolations and other forms of weaponization of life that are like presented to like the populations that are like meant to see this. Does like the mass amount of self-immolations coupled with like the idea that like as you mentioned, it's kind of human nature to just turn away and not really like consider the message that they're spreading. Does this create like desensitization to like these self-immolations and their message, and like does it cause like these groups or just people that are like trying to spread their message to adopt other forms of weaponization as well?
I think generally speaking, we tend to turn away from them, but then even when it is included in the media, it's not presented in that correct form. Like the Western gaze is either veiling what is trying to be conveyed, or the media is just hesitant to present it overall. So yes, I think we've been desensitized in the sense that we don't really understand that there's humans behind this. I think even with suicide terrorism, if you look at Tamil Tigers, for example, to me, it makes sense why they did this. The fact that they were being discriminated against, they felt a sense of oppression. We should be able to understand the causes behind this and realize why they're doing it. Now, what tactic they resort to, that's a bit more difficult to understand, but we need to understand that humans are searching for a sense of agency and ways to defy oppression. Jonathan?
So in the many instances where life has been weaponized, especially in defensive, in the case of defensive tactics, do you personally think that, well, the use of like mass media to like spread these instances to a greater audience obviously has been able to publicize it more, but it's also led to the deterioration of the message somewhat. Do you personally think that it is worth it in some cases for it to reach that greater audience, or do you think there's a line that shouldn't be crossed?
I mean, you alluded to it, but like media is both good and bad. It is giving these actors a chance to speak the way they want to, but other people can also distort the message. I think that right now, democracies are not always sticking to their commitment to uphold human rights. And I think the most obvious example is Guantanamo Bay, as the US isn't giving detainees their proper rights. So I think in that case, when those detainees have access to the lawyers who then have access to social media, for now, media, I think, is a slightly more positive tool just because we don't have governments that are doing the right thing. Blake.
So I know you discussed how, especially with self-immolation, but mainly with like terrorism, like bombing, about like suicide bombings, how there can often be like a lack of empathy for the cause whenever you have violence that is either very brutal or like targets many civilians as well. How would you say that lack of empathy stands as a roadblock to like that perpetrator's mission?
I think overall the lack of empathy is why we're not able to like resolve those issues behind it. If we relegate like suicide terrorism to a specific group or cause, then we're not understanding why people are actually doing this, because it has to do with a specific mission. And like I said before, in many cases, they are legitimate causes. Of course, we cannot necessarily justify their use of violence, but addressing that this isn't some mental health issue or psychological predisposition is the first point. Those people are still human, and if they've been radicalized in some form, we need to find a way to de-radicalize them as well.
One more question.
Any more questions? Caitlin?
How has advancements in technology made suicide terrorism easier or harder?
I would say overall it has been an advantage, as I was talking about earlier. Propaganda is probably the biggest thing, just because terrorist organizations now have access to radios, social media, television, etc. And so that can seep into the minds of people. But then also in terms of weapons, it's more easily accessible to get their hands on what they need. And it doesn't really take much to make a bomb or any other sort of effective weapon. So this overall technology is in advantage of those who want to use the weaponization of life.
Thank you. Committee, let's get a photo up here. Let's put your opening slide up. And then mom and dad will get a photo in a second. Good turnout. Look at this crowd. King, you want to get this photo? Oh, yeah. Let's put you. We want the slide to show.
Yeah, we want the slide.
Oh, yeah. Let's.
Please be where I need to be.
Yeah,
King, help us
right
out.
over here. There we go. Yeah.
Is that it?
Honestly, I think it might. I don't know if y'all can like see it there. Is the light coming in?
Do we want to? I think we can see the front of the court.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then you and I can be right.
Right here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's better. I can see your faces. 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Yeah.
Did we get it?
Mom, dad.
Yes, absolutely. One, two, three.
You're welcome.
Josh, while we get set up.
Where was
Okay. All right. You got your water. All right. Come on in, guys. Have a seat. Ben, good scholars.
So do we need to start like a new video or?
I think it just goes.
Okay.
Anyone else take it?
I think it's personally fine if we just keep it a big video, but.
I had an interesting one myself, so I didn't have much time. Right. Yes, yes, even the little kids. Yeah, it's phenomenal. Yeah. And somebody was here. Yeah.
really excited to
Hey,
come.
Josh, can you stand back there?
I really want to
to
be
record?
Yeah.
I think that's okay. Yeah.
You were late in line, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, I am. Yeah. Like, no, I read this whole thing. Like, oh, yeah.
What a team.
Yeah, it's really nice. Like,
Alex, we have yours printed? Not gonna let me down?
We will.
We will. Doesn't sound good. All right. Well, we need to wait until exactly. Katie said, watching the live stream from DC, Miriam killed it. Super excited to see John. Veronica, you
Pretty.
gave me a lot of grief this weekend, Veronica. I want you to know that. You care even? I'm gonna say you probably don't.
But were you here at 3 a.m. trashing the place? No, she wasn't, so there you go. So at least that, so we take that. Exactly, yeah. Or one. You're really just trying
Didn't go well.
Yeah.
When you're building,
Last year they did not.
in the general. No.
We did. I don't know.
All right. Let's see, make sure we got it. Just one more minute. Some of our alums are watching from out of state, which is really cool. Heard from some thesis veterans here, so that's nice. Juniors, you getting excited or nervous? Which one?
So excited.
Excited? How about nervous? No?
No. I'm getting, oh wait.
Let's see, we need someone to get the door when it's at the appropriate, oh, it's all right. Ready? Good. Welcome, everyone. Day one, number two, Josh Diaz. Again, this is a topic I'm so fascinated with, this idea of the secularization thesis and the battle between politics and religion and modernity in the last 30 to 40 years. Such a relevant topic. And again, as you all know, Josh will be attending Georgetown University. And again, I've got some Georgetown current students watching this right now. It has been a joy to work with these two. I mean, Miriam and Josh have been phenomenal leaders of Model UN, but just academic leaders. I mean, this is the pinnacle of what, success of what PA is about. I mean, the students have worked so hard on these projects, and you're seeing a year's worth of hard work. In Josh's case, 110 page honors thesis project. And those in the audience are not familiar. The requirement for thesis is 50 pages, but many students go above and beyond. I think this year, I haven't got an average. I'm sure it's going to be well over 70 pages, the average project will be. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and protege, Josh Diaz.
Thank you, Mr. Toppich. My name is Josh Diaz, and my honors senior thesis is titled God's Not Dead, the Clash of Secularism and Religion in Post-Colonial States. The purpose of this thesis has been to reconcile how religion can bring peace and division across different societies. Firstly, this thesis explores the genesis and spread of the secularization thesis and how it has been proven false. I then transition into my studies of the political and cultural attitudes towards faith and secularity in India and Nigeria, which serve as my two preeminent case studies for examining the interaction of church and state outside of the West. Ultimately, this thesis purports that we are living in a post-secular era defined by the intersection of religious identities and secular governance. There were three books and authors that really helped me understand the role of religion in international politics as well as within my case studies. In Global Rebellion, Religious Challenges to the Secular State, Mark Juergensmeyer explores the religious revival experienced in the 1980s as a direct response to the spread of secularism. He shows how the dual diffusion of the nation-state framework and a Western understanding of religion is foundational to the complex relationship between politics and religion in the modern era. For my India chapter, Modi's India by Christoph Jaffrelot was my most helpful source in tracking the growth of the modern Hindu nationalist movement. He shows how different modern India has become from that of what her founders intended based on the politicization of religious identities. The 10th parallel by Eliza Griswold covers the clash of Muslim and Christian communities along the 10th parallel, and Nigeria is her opening case study. While Griswold does an excellent job at examining Muslim-Christian tensions, she also exposes how these religions have come together and influenced each other at times. The Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, the Open Access Religions Journal, and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University have all also been instrumental in helping me hear from a variety of perspectives on secularism and the politicization of religion in India and Nigeria. The original secularization thesis came about in the 1960s with the simple question, is God dead? Which essentially asks whether religion was losing its social influence around the world. Many experts answered yes. Intellectuals during this time period believed that the world as a whole would see a complete divorce of politics and religion. Sources of authority and truth would stem from science and logic, and religious beliefs would be relegated to personal and private matters. On the whole, the secularization thesis was simply defined as the process whereby religious thinking, practices, and institutions would lose their social significance. Other prominent sociologists, such as Peter Berger, went as far as to say that by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. The basis for these claims can be found through the process of decolonialization and the general diffusion of Western thought after World War II. Following World War II, there is a huge emphasis on conflict prevention, as well as creating a rational world order. Secularism was seen as a central component in this endeavor in order to modernize and progress past the violence of the past. Additionally, the two remaining world powers, the US and the USSR, were both staunchly secular. Statesmen and politicians from former colonies around the world, such as India, Nigeria, Iran, Egypt, and even Cuba, all redefined their nations as secular ones and enshrined secularism into their constitutions. These men were generally all Western educated, and many felt as if their countries needed to modernize, which they defined as being more alike to Western powers. Secularization turned out to be more than a political process. It came to be viewed as an assault on an individual's very identity. Political movements underpinned by religious fundamentalism cropped up around the world in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism throughout the 1980s, causing academics and intellectuals to begin to make note of a religious revival in politics, as well as to abandon the notion of the secularization thesis. The two case studies I have chosen to analyze this intersection of faith and secularity was the Hindu nationalist movement in India and Islamic nationalism in Nigeria. These nations both have extremely religious populations and were subject to secularization under British colonialism. Together, the unique experiences of these countries with religion illustrate why religion still matters today and how faith coexists with secularism. Hinduism did not exist as an organized religion or cohesive identity before colonialism, and actually referred to a broad array of different rituals, traditions, and sacred texts. Indian religions also did not dichotomize between religion and politics. This is partly due to the fact that Hinduism historically differs from Western religions and that it does not contain a canon scripture, organizational body or church, or central spiritual authorities. This lack of organization meant that the state would act as a central political and spiritual authority. This relationship worked so well for so long because India also possesses a long tradition of religious tolerance and syncretism. Hindu and Islamic kings in pre-colonial India respected each other's faith immensely, and there is a large degree of cultural exchange between these and other religious groups. Religious conflict was spiked drastically when the British formally colonized India in 1857. To handle India's astonishing religious diversity, the British explicitly engaged in divide and rule policies to efficiently manage the logistics of colonization as well as to prevent uprising. Lord Elphinstone, a British statesman and colonist, wrote of India in 1857 that divide et imperia was an old Roman maxim and it shall be ours. This translates to divide and conquer and refers to the policies designed to maintain control over India by encouraging dissent between the various religious groups on the subcontinent. The laws of the British Raj were inherently secular, but they quickly found that local faiths cannot just be ignored. Thus, exceptions were made for personal laws in regards to marriage, divorce, inheritance, and succession, based on religious texts. Several laws began being implemented to appease Hindus, Muslims, and the growing Christian population, leading to a significant clash of laws in British India. Personal laws became significant markers of communal identity and actualized the British conception of Hindu and Muslim communities in India as extremely distinct and inherently oppositional. To win the electoral majority in this new system the British set up and sway with the British, political opportunists founded Hindu reformist movements and political parties, such as the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj, that sought to unify Hinduism. They argued that Islam and Christianity would displace traditional Hindu beliefs if Hinduism did not become more organized and orderly. However, they inadvertently westernized local Indian traditions by creating a more reductive but unified and authoritative form of Hinduism. Religious groups overcame their differences briefly to gain their collective independence from Britain in 1947. While independence marked the culmination of a unified Indian struggle, partition sparked decades of religious tensions as Muslims fled for the Muslim-majority Pakistan and Hindus vice versa. The mass movement of people to and from India and Pakistan resulted in killing, looting, raping, and wide-scale destruction between Hindu and Muslim communities. Now, Indians of all creeds were horrified by the violence of partition, leading to the secular Congress Party to become the most dominant faction of the independence coalition. Jawaharlal Nehru, as a constitutional drafter, leader of the Congress Party, and India's first president, enshrined secularism not only into India's constitutions, but into India's national character. He defined secularism in an Indian context as the equal respect for all religious disciplines. The Congress Party fostered Indian secularism carefully until the 1980s, when India saw the dual rise of religious nationalism as well as the fall of Congress Party due to corruption and scandals. The RSS was a Hindu reformist movement that started in 1922 and came to represent the Hindu right after independence. The RSS, after independence, moved to become a parent organization to other movements such as the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj, and founded several important civil society organizations such as trade unions, student groups, and religious bodies. This network came to be known as the Sangh Parivar, or the family of the RSS, and provided the basic support needed for the eventual founding of their political wing, the BJP, in 1980. The BJP was created when much of the world was experiencing a religious revival in politics in the 1980s. It started off as a leader in a larger anti-Congress coalition. Finally, in the 2014 election season, though, the BJP gained enough traction to free itself from other coalitions due to the downfall of the Congress Party, economic struggles, and the charismatic leadership of their Prime Minister candidate, Narendra Modi. The campaign of the BJP and Modi in 2014 was extremely successful because it focused on these issues. The elements of its Hindu nationalism mission could still be clearly seen. However, the extent to which Hinduism would be integrated into the government and laws was not communicated until after the Hindu right was comfortably situated in power. This resulted in a bait and switch. However, the Hindu right has been so effective in demonizing Muslims and propping itself up that it has been able to continue winning elections as well as imposing its ideology onto India. The modern ideology of the BJP, the RSS, and the Hindu right is referred to as Hindutva. Hindutva is the idea that to be truly Indian is to be Hindu. This term fuses the idea of religion, nationality, and culture all under one. This idea underlines all of the BJP's actions and has flourished in India's current political climate. One of the most violent consequences of this has been cow vigilantism. Groups such as the Cow Rakshaks go around India, killing those accused of cow slaughter or those working in the beef industry, since cows are a sacred Hindu symbol. Their victims are mostly Muslims, and most of the time they act on accusation rather than fact. After Modi won again in 2019 and the BJP held on to its legislative majority, the Hindu right has moved to implement more official laws designed to increase the Hindu population of India and decrease the presence of religions like Islam in India. Examples include the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Bill, which is the first bill in India's history to implement religious criteria for citizenship because it grants Hindus expedited citizenship into India. Several states have also imposed restrictions on interfaith marriages based on the love jihad conspiracy theory, which posits that Muslim men are marrying Hindu women solely to convert them. Whether at the state or national level, the policies being implemented are designed to maintain the Hindu majority and disadvantage other religious minorities. Despite these authoritarian laws, not all hope is lost for India. During the partition, when religious tensions were arguably at their highest, a Sikh doctor named Kashteva Singh saved the lives of many Muslims and Hindus. In his book, Love is Stronger Than Hate, Singh says he helped because of the tenets of his faith, such as service to humanity, compassion, and generosity. There exist many more instances of Hindus saving Muslims and vice versa during partition that Singh observed in his book. These acts of compassion is how India managed to stay together during the partition crisis. Religious communities came together again as the Modi administration floundered in its COVID-19 response and pinned the blame on Muslims. Local Hindu, Sikh, and Jain temples began coordinating with Christian churches and Islamic mosques in certain cities to provide support for the poor and sick. Faith has continuously kept India united during times of crisis, such as during partition and COVID, and has proven to be one of the country's greatest strengths rather than a hindrance. Now on to Nigeria. Islam was first introduced into Nigeria from its northern borders as Islam spread down into Africa. The inhabitants of northern Nigeria began practicing Islam as trade with the Muslim empires became more important. Eventually, Nigerian Muslim kingdoms rose to prominence in the Middle East and North Africa trade, and much of the population converted, displacing traditional African religion in this region. In 1803, an Islamic scholar named Uthman Dan Fodio launched a jihad against the various Muslim Nigerian kings because he felt they were not properly adhering to Sharia law, and he established the Sokoto Caliphate. He united over 30 different emirates in this caliphate, making the Sokoto Caliphate one of the most powerful kingdoms in Western Africa and standardizing the practice of Islam in this region. Christianity, on the other hand, was introduced to Nigeria from its southern coastlines. Christianity took off in the south because its geography allowed exposure to European trade routes. These routes brought missionaries to build schools, hospitals, and other needed services along the coast. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Britain would establish two colonies called the Southern Nigerian Protectorate and the Northern Nigerian Protectorate. It made sense to have two separate territories because the North was almost entirely Muslim and the South almost entirely Christian. Additionally, the North had its own Islamic system of government and the South had its own tribal system of government. However, in 1914, a British officer by the name of Frederick Lugard unified the protectorates as Nigeria. The decision to combine the territories had two motivations. First was simply administrative convenience, as the British could consolidate its Western African territories into one. However, the amalgamation of these territories was also meant to prevent opposition to British authority. The British adopted a divide and rule policy, pitting Muslims and Christians against each other politically, culturally, and economically. During the colonial period, British officers would blatantly exploit the religious differences in Nigeria by implementing a Western style of government in the South and preserving Islamic government structures in the North. This tactic is an aspect of divide and rule policy known as indirect rule. By keeping Islamic law in place, the British could reap the benefits of religious legitimacy while still puppet mastering Sharia law in the North. This power structure kept the Muslim North as a politically dominant entity since they were not completely overhauling their government. It also resulted in the North being much poorer than the South as the British only built schools, hospitals, and banks in southern Nigeria. Sustaining these differences were intentional on part of the British and were meant to sow division between Muslim and Christians. This is reflected in a quote from Lugard. What we often call the Northern Protectorate of Nigeria today can be better described as the poor husband, whilst its southern counterpart can be fairly described as the rich wife of this woman of substance and means. A forced union of marriage between these two will undoubtedly result in peace, prosperity, and maritable bliss for both husband and wife for many years to come. It is my prayer that this union will last forever. This analogy is deeply disturbing, but nonetheless accurate as to the intention of the British, as well as the resulting power structure of independent Nigeria. Nigeria would gain its independence in 1960 and tried to implement a secular civilian government. This first republic, though, would only last about 3 years, and from 1963 until 1999, the nation was rocked by civil wars and near constant coups. In this time period, the country would experience nearly 40 years of military rule, almost exclusively headed up by Muslims located in the north. Of the heads of state here, 11 out of 12 are Muslim, and many displayed an unfair preference for Islam over Christianity in their policies. Religious tension and communal fighting were also extremely frequent during this time period, and major riots with death tolls ranging in the high 100s broke out almost monthly. Riots got especially violent starting in the 1980s when the world was experiencing the so-called religious resurgence. The conflicts were started over things as small as the placement of markets in villages, or as large as when a Muslim military leader enrolled Nigeria secretly into the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The violence of this time period motivated Nigerians to come together and form the fourth and longest lasting Republic of Nigeria in 1999. The country came together after several decades of military rule to elect a Christian from the south named Chief Obasanjo. A new constitution was also drafted to transition Nigeria into democracy and reaffirm the country's secular character. Despite the achievement of the Fourth Republic and the reinstitution of secularism, voting patterns after 1999 quickly split again along religious and regional lines over religious-related issues. Sharia law has been one of those polarizing issues in modern Nigeria. In 1999, the governor of the northern state of Zamfara re-extended Sharia law to criminality for the first time since 1914. This was a blatant re-election tactic on his part, but several other states would follow suit, and to this day, the country is still split between states that are under Sharia law and those that aren't. The issue was a major point in the 2003 election, as Muslims felt it was their right to live under full Sharia law, while Christians felt that this was unfair. Nigerian politics today have actually been able to maintain religious and ethnic equality at the national level through three principles of ethno-religious balancing. First, the president's alternate religion. Two, the president and his vice are of different religions. And three, the president's alternate region. However, in the March 2023 elections, this unspoken principle of ethno-religious balancing was broken by the All People's Congress Party, who just won the election but had a Muslim succeeding a Muslim as their presidential candidate and a dual Muslim ticket. It seems as though the Muslim North is playing back into its tendency to dominate national politics, which risks stoking returned religious violence. However, much like India, not all hope is lost for Nigeria. In the riots of the 1980s and 1990s, Pastor James and Imam Ashafa each led gangs in the city of Kaduna. During one fateful clash, Ashafa's men cut James's arm off as he was defending a church, and James's Christian militia retaliated by killing two of Ashafa's brothers as well as his spiritual mentor. The two became sworn enemies on that day. However, the two men were reunited in the mid-1990s when they were brought together in a meeting of community leaders. Each of them went back to their communities and had powerful spiritual experiences, as detailed in the documentary, The Imam and the Pastor. Ashafa recounted the story of Muhammad forgiving those who persecuted him in Mecca, and James recounted the story of Jesus asking for mercy upon those who crucified him. Though it took years to build actual trust between the two battle-hardened men now run the Interfaith Mediation Center in the very city they once fought in, due to their faith and respect for each other's devotion. Now, these case studies demonstrate that we are living in a post-secular era, where both secular and religious dynamics continue to influence each other as separate but intertwined forces in society, culture, and politics. Nationality was supposed to be distinct from religion when India was made into a nation, but Indians nearly unanimously rejected this notion. However, after independence, the Hindu right responded by defining Indianness as being Hindu, whereas the Congress Party took the concept of secularism and infused it with traditional Indian beliefs of tolerance and syncretism. Nigerians also refuse to separate their national identities from their religious ones. Today, voting lines have become split along religious issues, and since the colonial founders of modern Nigeria emphasized religious differences as opposed to shared values, the attempts to implement secular governments have been thrown off course by retrenchment into religious identities. If the shared values of Islam and Christianity have been emphasized instead, perhaps modern Nigeria would more mimic the relationship of James and Ashafa. In both India and Nigeria, secularism has been unable to displace religion, and it most likely never will, because religion is something that speaks deeply to humans around the world. Being religious is not contradictory to being liberal or being modern, as those who colonized India and Nigeria have suggested, as demonstrated by the stories of interfaith efforts in Nigeria and the reconciliation of imams and pastors in Nigeria. Allowing faith to flourish may actually be necessary to solving today's crises. Thank you.
It does not seem as if Nigeria has an organized religious movement similar to the BJP in India. Does that fragmentation of the religious community and among Islam in Nigeria make this more problematic or more hopeful?
It can be more problematic in the sense that, like, if you look at the Muslim perspective, you do have like the very radical portions of it, like Boko Haram, but then you also have just political interest groups like the J&I that are much more moderate and actually want to work in the system to promote like Muslim nationality. But
Are you optimistic about these case studies in the sense of more reconciliation happening, or do you think this is going to still lead to more fragmentation, more religiously and culturally inspired violence in the future?
mm-hmm. For the foreseeable future, it seems like India is going to keep heading in a more authoritarian direction under the BJP. And I don't see the riots going on in Nigeria right now over the breaking of ethno-religious like balancing to quiet down anytime soon. So it does seem like that they will get worse. However, I did find that like playing more into faith and what they actually mean, like in a non-politicized format, would actually be the solution to solving these issues rather than like shoving off of those religious identities, like how it's been tried in the past in India and Nigeria.
Good answer. Mr. Vaughn.
Mm-hmm.
Back to Nigeria for a second, well, with India, Hinduism, it has been present for such a long time naturally. And with Nigeria, you're dealing with Christianity and Islam, which are maybe more recent imports, in comparison. I wondered if you ran across anything in Nigeria with animist native religions and what their role might be and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, with traditional African religions, they've definitely like mixed with both Islam and Christianity. And so those ideas that like in those like animist religions, there also was less delineation between political and spiritual authorities. And that sort of like will carry over into Christianity and Islam in Nigeria, in that like it's much harder to separate those identities from your spirituality and your political beliefs.
Yeah, that's all over the literature too. We look at like Chinua Achebe, great. And then thinking about the post-colonial framework here, are there any post-colonial nations that are getting it right, or is there anything outside the post-colonial framework that seems to be working? Because I'm also thinking of some nations that were not post-colonial, that the same mess is affecting.
There were definitely a lot of case studies that I like had to cut that I wanted to. And some were also post-colonial, some were outside of that framework, like the actual colonists. But as far as where this is working, I didn't study any other country specifically, like where it was working, but I did find like so many instances in the countries that I did study of India and Nigeria where like interfaith efforts were going to be the solution. So
good. Good.
I have a similar question, and we talked about this when you were planning.
Yeah.
And I kept coming back to it while I was reading. How could you make the secular trends that you read about in India and Nigeria relatable to a modern society outside of those two countries?
Could you ask your question
Yes.
again?
So in other words, you studied those two countries and the relationships between the political experiences and beliefs and then the secular and how they intertwined or divided the country. So in thinking like he just asked about other countries, how could you make what you learned about India and Nigeria relatable to modern societies outside of those two?
Everywhere, yeah. Even with like nations like the US that were proponents of secularism, and it was enshrined in the Constitution originally, religious tendencies still broken out here. And it speaks to the fact that you can't repress those directly and just expect everybody to give those up. But if you can embrace like what those religions actually say, because in the opening of my paper, I talk about how no religion like actively promotes violence against one another religion or division, but definitely like I believe nations outside of the West, and I'm sure there's many like studies and case studies out there that you could do where like interfaith efforts would yield similar results in bringing peace as opposed to division. But, yeah.
So I have high hopes for you in the future, and I know you're going to do great things,
Thank you.
Josh. And I think this will probably be something that moves you in your future. I see that you're greatly interested in it. I was curious, you know, when you study humanities, I think you learn from the past and how you can apply that to something that you care about in the future. So how could you take what you've learned from what you've written and apply it towards something that you're hopeful for in the future?
Well, yeah, I've always like talked about wanting to work in diplomacy or international relations, like in some capacity. So I think what's like really important about this thesis that I've taken away is that like there are limits to like Western culture as seen in India and Nigeria, and that you can't just like force what you believe onto them. And so like getting their perspective and like what their like culture / religions have to offer would be like very important to solving the actual issue in that country. But great question.
Thank you.
Congratulations on doing
Thank
a
you.
great job. You're killing it. As a latecomer to your thesis committee, I would like to ask a little bit about like your selection process for India and Nigeria. Why those two? Why not like say Northern Ireland, since you had your paper a couple of years ago on that? So what was it about these two that made the perfect one for your thesis?
So when I was originally planning this thesis, I had around 5 countries I was going to do, but I realized like with the detail I wanted to go into, like that wouldn't be feasible like in 1 year. So I cut it down to 2 post-colonial states because I thought that framework was really interesting. Because like I was saying earlier, I think it shows that large swaths of the world in like Asia and Africa just aren't compatible with like the Western understanding of how religion functions and like Western style of government, how that would work with Western religion. And so I ended up cutting like militant Buddhism in Southeast Asia, the Zionist movement in Israel, as well as Greek Orthodoxy in Russia and how Putin is using that to justify the Ukrainian war. But a lot of those aren't post-colonial states. So I just decided to narrow down on this aspect of it.
Kind of along the same lines, I do like the post-colonial connection, but we have seen a larger global divergence from secularism. And I'm wondering if you see just any kind of global trends that connect the, you know, not so post-colonial states to your case studies. And, you know, how do we reconcile that, say, in a country like the United States, where you have seen more of an integration of religion into politics recently?
I couldn't find like an exact answer about why, like in the 1980s, for example, there was religious resurgence in so many different like faiths in different countries around the world, whether they were colonial or colonists or post-colonial. But it seems like just those influences or those movements influence each other, or perhaps like just at the same time, because they all took place around 30-ish years after the secularization thesis. So it may have just been like, that's the amount of time it took to see that like, you can't just repress those identities, and that's the amount of time it took for them to spring back, is what I wrote about. Audience questions? Okay, Jana.
Okay, so if like Hindu nationalism like disappears and interfaith talks start happening like more frequently in India, do you think that India and Pakistan's relationship will like strengthen? And also, do you think that the I guess like stigmatization and biases between those two countries will like easily disappear, or will it take time?
Well, okay, even within India, like those tensions will not easily disappear, even if you can just get like people of different faiths to, you know, be in the same room and talk about how their faiths can work together. But I mean, I still believe that that's like a very important first step to allowing that to happen. Because like in Nigeria, which is a different country, that was what led the pastor and the mom in Kaduna to be able to start like reconciling their differences in their past. So I would say yes to that, but it's not going to be like an overnight fix, like by any means. So. Jonathan.
So for non-secular governments that have this that have a dominating religion that has power in the government, and with the there's a common theme of like oppression of the minority or various minority religions, with an exception being India, which traditionally has a past of like tolerance and syncretism. But how do you think that in these non-secular governments that have these dominating powers that are dominating religions that aren't as open to tolerance, how can or can not secularism be used as a medium for tolerance, and what are the challenges for that?
So yeah, when secularism was like implemented into India and Nigeria, it very quickly took on a separate definition than how it did in the West. Because like where in the West it could mean like non-religious, in these countries it began to mean being tolerant of all religions and equally respecting and whatnot. So I believe that yeah, secularism still has a role, definitely in like say a religious theology or theocracy like Iran, where it can be helpful to promote like more inclusivity and understanding of other religions. Like definitely religious attitudes and secular attitudes are both here to stay. And so that's like what the definition of the post-secular era is, where you can draw on both of those concepts. Any other questions? Anya?
Would you say that the rise of the international media, would you say that that has contributed to like this kind of religious revivalism or like rise of modern populism?
Yeah, the media was like, I didn't cover it much in my defense, but like that is how like a lot of religious movements were able to rally supporters and like spread conspiracy theories, which is pretty important, as I touched on with like love jihad in India. But yeah, I mean the media, like even in Merriam's thesis, can be used for like good or bad things, and it depends on how it's used. So,
what about economics? How does relative deprivation and marginalization play into religious tension, and how does it play into this narrative?
I'll use Nigeria as an example first. I touched on it in the presentation, but the South became much more richer and more affluent than the North. In the North, you know, they remained much poorer, and they just took on like a religious coloration. And so when the economics of this took on that, then it became like a lot more violent and heated, because a lot of conspiracy theories were also being shared in the North that like this was all one giant thing to disprivilege Muslims and improve the quality of life of Christians.
A piece of advice, or just answer this question, and maybe the juniors will take it in. What's the most challenging part of this 8 to 9 month journey? The research, the writing, the organization, time management as they head into their senior year in thesis. What would you advise them, and how would you advise them, and what area did you find most challenging?
I think the area that I've struggled in the most was outlining, for sure. And I would sometimes start writing without having like a clear plan about how I wanted my arguments to flow. And so then when you're dealing with this topic like this, where you're working with religion and politics, then it can get very muddled very quickly with what's what and like what's influencing what. So like take the time to outline. It might seem like that, researching is a huge block. You outline for a little bit and then you're writing for a huge block, but I think it's going to be really helpful if you spend more time outlining, though everyone has a different process.
Very good. Any other questions?
Looks like question.
I was just gonna say, I think that like, especially with like India and Nigeria being like post-colonial states, obviously like ethnic breakdown was really probably very influential on this topic.
Yeah.
So like, how would you say that like Nigeria being like an artificial state, like how would that like post-colonial ethnic like breakdown affect the religious tensions?
Yeah, I mean, with both India in Nigeria, but especially Nigeria, I mean, ethnicity becomes conflated with religion all the time. Whereas like you have the House of Fulani people in the north that are like mostly all Muslim, and then you have the Igbo people in the south, which are mostly Christian, and then you can have some groups like the Yoruba and other tribes that are half and half. But it just adds another component to the division in like the religious coloration of that, like economics can like heat those more. So, Ben, you have a question?
Okay, so you mentioned Iran earlier in like a response. Do you see like India and the BJP? Do you see that like moving towards like a theocracy like Iran, or is it not going like that?
That's a good question. With the laws that are being implemented that are like being designed to legitimately increase the Hindu population and like make sure other like religious minorities don't grow to take that majority, then if that keeps up, then yes, it could turn into a theocracy where laws are more based on Hinduism. So, no problem. Sarah?
So with the increase of like religious political mobilization in the United States, is there like some absolutely must nots that we can learn from what we learned in Nigeria and India?
That's a good question. I mean, I talked about with like the main takeaway was like to heed the perspective of other religions and not just like, from my perspective, like the Western gaze on it essentially. But I mean, even in the US, if you can take a look at the perspective of other people, like on the other side of it, and other religions in America, then yeah, I think that's a great lesson that can be taken away, even from like India and Nigeria's experiences with religion. So, yeah.
So I actually had this prepared for Miriam, but now that you brought up the Western gaze,
perfect.
So while doing research and taking notes and writing your thesis, did you ever have moments where you found it difficult to set aside your Western gaze?
Yeah, for sure.
And so, how did you make sure that your writing was, or your writing process was free of the Western gaze?
I don't know if it was completely free, but to combat that, what I tried to do was find perspectives from people of other faiths in other countries. The most helpful one in Nigeria was definitely that documentary that had, the interviews with Pastor James and Imam Shafa. And in India, I read a lot of like excerpts from, first person accounts like Dr. Singh about like how faiths would work together during partition. So I tried to intersplice a lot of first person narratives and try and understand what they were trying to communicate as opposed to just taking away what I would learn from it. Ms. King?
I have a question. I'm trying to formulate it, but
Okay.
When we talk about religion and human geography, we've talked about how both Islam and Christianity are proselytizing religions, and so it almost makes sense that there might be some conflict in Nigeria. But Hinduism, of course, is more of a personal path and it's non-proselytizing. So, how is it justifiable or beneficial to have that nationalistic component tied to more of an ethnic religion?
So that is a very good point, that Hinduism also differentiates from a lot of other Western faiths, and that it's non-proselytizing. But I didn't include in this presentation, but I almost did. But the Hindu reformist movements that I talked about that happened in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, the name's escaping me of what it's called, but it was like a major part of that is that you can convert people back to Hinduism on the premise that they were originally led astray by different religions. And so they're almost like going back and trying to justify proselytization in order to, again, grow the Hindu like majority, protect their majority in India. So, yeah. Jana?
I just have one last question. So you talked a lot about like solutions like interfaith talks, but like how exactly like would you initiate those like interfaith talks, and like are there any other like concrete solutions that like have been like thought of or just like or
The most successful like instances, especially in India, of like interfaith talks and interfaith like groups working together unfortunately have been like when crisis strikes and they realize that they need to set aside those differences. So I'm not saying that you need to create a crisis for two groups to solve each other, but in India and Nigeria, their interfaith talks just began by like the governor of Kaduna wanting to like stop the violence in his community. So he brought them together and that helped them on their own like spiritual journeys to forgive one another. But, so, I mean, it just starts with like that first step, I would say. That's it. Yeah.
Committee, come on up. Real deal committee. Well, we can. Yeah, get the title. We're gonna go back to the title. He was in it. Did I hear a rumor you were at 1 hour the first time you did this practice defense? Maybe.
If you could not be in front of the title slide, and if you could kind of not be so much in front of this window.
Okay, so you want to split? You want to split?
It doesn't matter, but I like it. Closer towards that way. Yeah.
Got it?
I think that'll work.
Got the casual look.
There we are. 1, 2, 3.
You want to join
All right. We get one? Oh, you did a great job.
Congratulations.
So,
Fantastic job. Very proud of you.
Thank you, Ms. Prim, for
I
coming.
never feel like I had anything to offer. I had to think long and hard. I don't know what I'm going to have. Very good. I think it was like over the long weekend. I think I read like 50 or 60 pages. Like, okay, I gotta figure out what's going on here. Here we go.
Yeah.
Juniors.
Very proud. Oh, that was the best.
Hey, I'm Kyle. I'm Josh's English teacher this year. My medal winner.
He carried the team.
But seniors always process. I don't know if that's the same case, but just remember that the freshmen they did. Oh, no, I don't think that they. When we do school activities, we always practice processional. But I don't think that's necessary. Yeah. I think they just go sit down. But it might be helpful for them to be advertised since they do the awards now. So that might be it. I know.
You want to get a picture?
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah, he's live, yeah.
Oh, he's watching online.
Y'all want to
Who
look
is?
over here? One, go second part. 1, 2, 3.
You didn't want your sister. You can take a selfie or something.
Of course.
She was.
You want to be in there too?
Great job, man. Great job.
You can do thesis, Emily?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Joy,
teaching.
a joy to work with. Oh, thank you guys so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming. Joy to teach. You're gonna do great things wherever you go. Ms. King, it's always a joy to come back for thesis time, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes. We've got a great academic community here.
They're not that bad. Oh, yeah.
No, my room was already a mess. I think it's okay. I can subtract to your, future skip days. Just let them think my room has already been hit because I had National History Day all over the place. All right, so look, I started a folder. So whoever, if you want to share, I'm going to share it with you right now, and I'll put it in the national folder. Our department folders.
Oh, Josh, do we need to just, the computer?
Yeah. You're supposed to shut his computer, he said. He'll leave it up for tomorrow. No, not right now.
So.
No.
Oh, so
I have
Josh-
slides I made.
Where that's-